values of sound. We may choose organic food at the supermarket and avoid inhaling others' cigarette smoke, yet we rarely pay attention to the equally positive or negative health impacts of sound, the other thing we put into our bodies. And some of you will recognize the source of that quote. And so I'm privileged to be here to honor the memory and accomplishments of Don Campbell. So I thought that perhaps one of the things you need to know is a little bit more about me and my class. As the bio suggests, I've been at Dartmouth for quite some time. I'm a pianist by training as well as a musicologist. But when I came to Dartmouth in 1999, that was the first year of Napster. And I was watching as my students were changing not only their behaviors, but their attitudes toward music. And it made me think that I wanted to step in and address some of these things, but I didn't quite know how. If you read my biography, you'll also see that I have a ministerial degree. And so for me, from the very beginning, as I was looking at this, there was an ethical component that we needed to explore. It wasn't until, I believe, 2010 that I had my first opportunity to try out some of my ideas in a class, a first-year writing seminar at Dartmouth, which was organized around music, neuroscience, and ethics. And because of limitations in the registrar's ability to handle characters, that's what my class is called now, music, neuroscience, and ethics. But the original title of my class, and the one I like to refer to it as, is Addiction, Obesity, Pollution, Thievery, and Other Music-Related Topics. Because I was dealing with thievery as my students, through Napster, were engaged in a different kind of way of understanding access to music. As I watched the explosion of iPods, I'm now seeing people with 80 to 160 gigabyte iPods thinking that they then needed to fill them. As you'll see in some of the other things I'm going to talk about, that we have music everywhere, probably too much. And in my experience with my students, to watch them try and dial back their musical experiences, only to discover that they would get grumpy, that they would physically manifest these withdrawal symptoms, and that when I suggested, well, maybe this is something akin to an addiction, most of them thought I was crazy until, and you'll see some of the things I have to share with you, until they had to articulate for themselves what was going on. So that's where I come from. In fact, I consider this the great musical experiment that we're undergoing here, especially in the Western Hemisphere, but we can see it in other places where we have this group. We really don't have a control group, as we are now experiencing music in ways that we've never experienced it before. And how do we cope with it? So, if you will, imagine with me something. All right, let's see. Okay. I would like your permission to insert a needle into a vein and hook that needle up to a tube and a device that will allow you always, wherever you are, to control your mood, to regulate your arousal, to change your chemical makeup and your brain architecture. All I require of you is for you to let me insert that needle. Most of you, my husband, who is squeamish about needles, he would absolutely say no. Most of us would not allow that kind of intervention into our physical bodies. But I would dare say that we are doing that with music. And one of the first things I wrote up on the board the last time I taught my class was this. When I told that to one of my colleagues, he, wow, okay, it just went off again.
No, it's back. It's back.
Okay, and I just got an electric shock, and the carpet's filled with static electricity. One of my colleagues said, thank goodness that music is a drug. The idea that it can regulate our moods, that it can heighten our sensitivity to the things around us. And I'm not opposed to music being a drug. And I'm using drug obviously very loosely. I understand that. But music has certain properties, and I do ask myself and my students the question, are we using them in a wise manner? Now, there are many things we know about music, and the three things I'm going to talk about are only three. There are more than those. But we know, and I've already alluded to it, that music arouses us and affects our mood. By arousal, I mean it grabs our attention. So we perk up when we hear music in certain kind of ways, happy or sad or angry or whatever we want to talk about. And I can talk about happy and sad and angry music. How is it that the human species across cultures seem to identify these things? If you know the music instinct, you saw an example of that in, I want to say, Mali. My colleague Talia Wheatley has demonstrated some of this in Cambodia. Cultures that know nothing about Western music that are able to articulate hearing certain musics. That is angry, that is happy, that is sad. So we have that across cultures. It seems deeply embedded in who we are. Music arouses us, and it does affect our moods and can reflect our mood. Change it as well as speak to it. We also know some things about music and sound in general that we habituate to it. And by habituation, I think the easiest thing to do is to show you a little bit of David Huron, who's done a little bit of this work. Many of you have seen this video. Here's a little clip of him talking about habituation. Up. This is really okay. One more time. All right. Let's go back here. All right.
One of the most important mental mechanisms we have is the perceptual version of been there, done that. That is the ability to ignore the commonplace. Perhaps the most important mental mechanisms we have for ignoring things is habituation. Habituation is regarded as the simplest form of learning. We can define habituation as a decrease in responsiveness resulting from the repeated presentation of an eliciting stimulus. We hear a sound, and we hear it again, and we hear it again, and with successive repetitions, we respond less and less and less to that stimulus.
Now, this is true about sound. Music is sound. And if you've ever wondered how is it possible for you or somebody else to fall asleep in the middle of a concert that you really like the music, it's partly because you've habituated to the sound. Our students who listen to music for 3 or 5 or 7 hours at a time, who think they are listening, are not even hearing the music after a while. They've habituated to it. And so it is something that the brain is working on, but they cease to hear it. So we know these things about music, about arousal and mood, habituation, and the distinction with music between listening to music versus practicing music. I'll refer to Schellenberg later. Many of you know his work, but some things we know about music. Now, I am not a neuroscientist by training, but I did sleep at a Holiday Inn Express last night. It was really Best Western. So I am looking forward for somebody to tell me, oh, we do know these things about music, so forgive me if I'm not up to speed on everything. But we don't know fully the impact of constant or lengthy exposure in the ways that we're watching our students and some of our peers, ourselves, maybe spending as much time experiencing music as we are now. And by that, I'm not just talking about headphones. I'm talking about we have, rings on our fingers and bells on our toes. We have music wherever we go now. So we don't fully know what the impact is of this. Along those lines, what is the impact of being exposed to what I call secondhand sound? We spend a lot of time in this culture talking about trying to isolate people from secondhand smoke. But what about going to the supermarket, going to a restaurant? All these places where music comes into our lives, it's ubiquitous, but it's often invisible. What is the impact of that? George Prochnick and other people are looking at the importance of silence. I want to explore in my own thinking and my own writing what the impact of secondhand sound is, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. And we don't fully know the impact of what I call fatty, salty, and sugary music. And I look at some of the things that Michael Moss and other people are doing, talking about foods. And I look at some of the music that we have, and it's delightful, it's catchy, it gets us the same way that fatty, salty, and sugary foods do. What is the impact of a constant diet of that? I think it has to have some impact, but I don't think we fully understand what that impact would be. All right, so let's go on. So what's wrong with easy listening? When I talk about these kind of things, I was talking to Joanne back there, the whole notion of easy listening for people of a certain generation, it conjures up the Mantovani strings, and I'm talking about much more than that. Casual listening is another way I talk about this. Well, first of all, this kind of easy listening is very useful to help time pass by, especially if you're involved in repetitious activities. So if you're at the gym, or if you are, certain kind of jobs. In fact, there are whole studies about, jobs that have regular rhythms, how music may help make those jobs go faster. And you can think of people working on railroads, singing work songs. So we have that kind of thing. It's useful to help time pass by. It's useful as an initial stimulus. Again, the arousal factor of music happening. It is also useful as a neurological modulator. I've already talked about it helps with moods in certain kind of ways. I've already suggested that it is doubtful as a constant stimulus, partly because of habituation, and partly because of other things coming into our environments when we are engaged in listening to music. We already have heard a little bit about that music can be harmful as a contributor to hearing loss. Again, I'm preaching to the choir there. If you don't know the studies, I'm happy to direct you to them. I think it's also harmful as an auditory anesthetic, that so much listening to music on a constant basis pulls us away from hearing what's going on. And I'd like to suggest that it is harmful as a neurological contaminant. I'll come back to that at the very end, near the very end of the talk, but that it runs interference with our neurological development in certain kind of ways. Again, I hope I'm preaching to the choir, but I also hope maybe some of the things I have to say will provoke. So I'm going to talk about easy listening relative to various spaces as I'm thinking about the effects of easy listening. So a couple of anecdotes as I was getting here. So there was a 60-something guy on the bus from where we live. It takes 3 hours by bus to get to the airport. And so this 60-something guy had his headphones on and he had them down where they were here as opposed to here. And so the sound was bleeding through, and so I heard it through the grapevine, even though I'm across the aisle from him. I finally had to go and say, could you put your headphones over your ears? And he said, whoa, technology nowadays. It's like, no, you don't know how to use headphones apparently. But that was a public space that he was engaged in his music, but that it bled into my sonic area. The 30-something woman on the plane 2 seats away from me, her headphones were put on properly, but they were loud enough that I could hear what she was hearing. I could only wonder what her hearing loss envelope would look like. The car at the intersection with the windows rolled down. I don't know what it is about our world that we think we have the right, people think they have the right to advertise and to share with everyone around them the music that they're listening to. I sound like an old person. I am. The fraternity party with the speakers on the lawn, and I can think of also if we go to Jamaica and those kind of block parties where these kinds of things happen, where we invade the sonic universe with these kind of sounds. These are public spaces, and yet we are polluting them. May I use that word? We are polluting them with sound. The woman who works at the diner. This is an interesting story, and I have the article from Randy Cohen of The Ethicist. These two women who worked at a diner who were really bothered by having music played in the diner. And Randy Cohen, in his role as ethicist, basically said these women need to get over themselves. And I wrote to Randy and I said, or Mr. Cohen, I wrote to him and I said, you don't seem to understand how this really might be a problem for certain kind of people. He wrote back and said, again, I was being too sensitive. And it's kind of, when people tell me something like that, it's like, I'm really glad my dentist doesn't tell me, you're too sensitive. And I think that we're in a place in our world where we're going to be confronting this more and more. In fact, there are the challenges and the ethics of secondhand sound that we have to begin to deal with. And I don't know if we're going to engineer our way out of this. When I talk to my engineering friends, they say there are problems. How do you isolate sonic transmission? And so it's more than just knocking on the wall of your neighbor to say, can you turn that down? I think once we understand how disruptive certain sounds are exposed to over a long time, that we as a society are going to have to say, we all have to cool it on these kinds of things. Some of you probably know this wonderful video. Video is mostly about autism, but I would like to extrapolate that this is something that more and more of us are experiencing in the world today, as sound becomes more and more an assaultive, inescapable component of our world. How are we going to deal with the sonic overload that we're dealing with? I think, again, remember what I said about one of the things about easy listening that it does, it anesthetizes us. And so there's this interesting situation that perhaps people listen to a lot of music to try and avoid this. But there are other issues that we need to address. Maybe we can try and dial down all the sound around us, including a lot of the secondhand music that we hear. Easy listening in social spaces. I'm going to talk here a little bit about how our approach to listening to music has changed. And so one of the things I've already alluded to is the distinction between listening to music and the making of music. And that's been a shift that we can attribute in large part to the creation of the phonograph. And so for the last 140 years or so, our approach to music has been one where instead of getting in the parlor, I'd love to show my students Meet Me in St. Louis. Instead of getting in the parlor and singing songs together and playing music together, we now have supplanted that with listening to music. I've already mentioned Glenn Schellenberg. Again, you probably know this article. He talks about these kind of issues about listening to music versus the making of music. And he concludes this article, or it might be in a book chapter, is music a quick fix to the problem of intelligence? The answer is most definitely no. Short-term positive benefits of music listening dissipate rapidly as listeners' arousal level and mood fluctuate with time and experience. Although music lessons have relatively long-term benefits, the effort involved, weekly lessons, daily practice, can hardly be construed as a quick fix. And yet in our social spaces, we're trying to wrestle with what this change means. In the abstract, and I'm not unfortunately going to talk much about Venezuela, China, Congo, and Paraguay. But very quickly, El Sistema, all the kinds of things that are coming out of with Chinese musicians. If you don't know about the Land Philharmonic in Paraguay, and then the Kinshasa Symphony, all very interesting projects where these are people who are engaged in the making of music in environments where that doesn't seem to make sense. And yet we're watching as what happens with these people in the making of music. They are becoming, if you'll permit me, more human as a result of that. And we should be encouraging those kinds of things within our worlds as well. There's this marvelous quote that Nina Kraus said at a conference I was at in Montreal back in May. The tension between listening and making music. You don't become physically fit from watching spectator sports. We all know that. But there's more to it than that. Because watching sports takes away the time and the studies show the energy from actually making sport. And by extension, listening to music takes time and energy away from making music as well. So here's another place where listening to a lot of music, emotionally and in terms of physically, robs us of time to do other things that may make us neurologically better equipped to handle the world around us. So shifting from making music to listening to music, there's also the shift from listening to music together to listening to music alone. And again, this is a major cultural shift. There is this clip, I believe it comes out of a book a colleague of ours, Mark Katz, wrote of this, and it has this picture in it of this, buy a Victrola, and if you do so, you invite all these opera singers into your home to regale your guests. But the larger interesting thing about this is that all the guests are there assembled around the Victrola. And that was something that people did. If you don't know the movie A Letter from Three Wives, I don't have time to play it for you, but there's a scene there where they listen to the Brahms Second Piano Concerto in its entirety at a dinner party. Now, we don't watch it. That would be 50 minutes of watching it. But that was the implication that together they listened to that Brahms. And it looks like it was on 78, so that's a lot of flipping of discs. So this was, for many decades, the idea that when we listened to music, we did it in